So super excited to be talking about this topic, recruiting and motivating a sales org in 2022 and beyond. Brings me back to my sales days. I still think of myself as a sales rep, and eager to hear Ken and Olivia's thoughts on this. I guess let's start off with a couple brief intros. So hi, everybody. I'm Arthur, Senior Manager of Field Marketing and Community here at Chili Piper. Really a sales rep at heart. Have only been in marketing for a year now. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. And why don't I kick it off to Ken to introduce yourself?
Perfect. Thanks, Arthur. I'm excited to be here with the folks from Chili Piper, including Olivia. So Ken Lundeen, and so many of you know or don't know, I'm the president of RevHeat. And so we're a business growth consulting agency who've had some clients who've done some pretty cool stuff, worked with a couple of unicorns, had 8 acquisitions in the last 5 years, and worked with some publicly traded companies. So we're seeing some really, really crazy stuff happen on the recruiting and motivating side of the world, and I'm fired up to talk about it.
Guess that leaves me. So hello, my name is Olivia Nielsen. So I am the Senior Director of Sales Development for Chili Piper. Not to date myself, but it's been about 16 years all in my sales career, working up into this leadership aspect of it. Recruiting and motivating is something that's so near and dear to my heart, and hopefully is near and dear to all of your hearts. So hopefully you get something out of our conversation today.
Amazing. And 2 quick reminders. I think everybody's chat defaults to hosts and panelists. So make sure to change that to everyone so we can see you in the chat, which brings me to my second point. We want to hear from you. So obviously we have some content here. We're going to talk about it, but we're guessing there's a reason you joined this webinar, and probably some topics are top of mind for you. So feel free to use the Q&A. Feel free to use the chat. If you want to even come up on stage and have a conversation here with Ken and Olivia, we would love that as well. So hey, Joe, we are ready to kick this thing off. So I got my first question for you two. Let's talk about what is different about recruiting today versus even last year, and maybe how we can start preparing for 2023 and beyond. Maybe we'll have Ken kick us off here.
Perfect. Yeah, I think things are changing at an exponential rate to some extent. If you really think about the things that have happened, you know, the Great Resignation's an ongoing thing where people are leaving the workforce. The labor force has been incredibly tight. You've seen salaries continue to just absolutely skyrocket for, you know, everything from administrative positions all the way through, particularly in sales. I mean, look at the, you know, Olivia, Liv can speak to this. I mean, the SDR role, you know, you used to be able to hire somebody out of college, $35,000, $40,000 just 2-3 years ago. And then if you really think about it now, we're seeing like the starting salary for somebody with no experience and an entry-level sales role ends up being between 60 and 70,000. That's before variable comp. So you have that going on with a tight labor market, increasing stuff. And then I think in addition to that, you're having the biggest transformation in employer expectations, probably since the introduction of the union. We're really moved from like a we society, like where corporate culture was the thing you used to be able to hang your hat on to recruit with, to hey, you know, what can you do for me? I want to, you know, be able to take my kids to school at 9 and be able to pick them up at 3 and then be off by 5 still. And so you've really seen a change in expectations, you know, as far as where we are today. I don't know. I mean, Liv, what have you seen when you start to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can remember from my self experience getting my first sales job out of college and being like $40,000. Like, this is amazing. So now I look at what we're hiring. I'm like, good for y'all. This is great. But yeah, I think it's really on that the employer expectations is before it was, you know, what is the culture that the employer is going to give me? What can I get? But now we've really taken a step back. And I think a lot of individuals during this time have said, what do I need to be successful? What do I want in a career? And how can you provide that for me? So we've almost flipped the script, which as an employee feels like a very good, healthy place to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think when you say that, the thing about this that just really just kind of jumped out to me that I don't know I've put to words before was simply this. The reason that was able to happen is because employers had done such a poor job of helping employees to become successful, particularly in sales.
Yes. I think what happened during this time too is we as employers had just run on autopilot on the things that we thought that people wanted. We didn't take a step back to say, what do you need to be successful? What do you want to see from the company? And I think for a long time, what you were talking about, it was that culture, it was the kombucha, it was like the fun part of it. Now we take a step back and what is it doing for my career growth? What is it doing for my advancement? Where can I play a part in this? And what are you, again, going to do for me to support my growth there? So I think it's really forced employers to take a step back and say, man, we just kind of ran on an operating system that worked for a long time. What does this new world actually look like? And how do we give employees what they want to receive so we can continue to retain them and they're happy, healthy humans?
Yeah. And I know that we just keep going back and forth, but the other thing that's really happened is, like, my belief system is that it's a manager or leader's job to understand what the professional personal goals are of their employees and then show them how the company can be a vehicle to achieve that. What this really says is we've done a really poor job at doing that. And now, because just even what you were focused on there, Liv, in your comments was, hey, my professional goals, my professional growth, whatever. I think the thing that's been present and really brought into this right now is, hey, you better respect my personal life too. Mm-hmm. Because we were allowed to make people grind for a while, and now you got to figure out how to measure it to allow them to actually have a happy and healthy life outside of work, even though employment is what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's that shift from not working to live, it's working to live. We're not living to work. And that, I think, just it's a beautiful thing that's happening, but just we have to catch up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it is really nice to see this power shift from employer to employee and having it be a little bit more balanced there. So, okay, we've talked about what's going on today. What can the audience kind of expect maybe over the next 2 years based on where we're at?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a widening in the gap between the good and the great. So because there's so many other things going on with recruiting and motivating. It's hard to get sales talent. It's hard to onboard them. It's hard to get them. And then at the end of the day, quite frankly, less than like 13% of sales managers are given any formal training on how to do things. So over the next 2 years, I think the difference between the good and great teams is going to widen. I think that disparity between them, because the companies who dig in and understand how I can get and motivate my people, recruit and train my people in this economy, what's going to be interesting is they're not going to have the same problems that the company not paying attention to these things are, because they're going to be able to change and mold the expectations. And so the question you have to have if you're an employer, or the question you have to have if you're a manager or a leader trying to hire, really comes down to, do I want to continue to struggle to attract high performing talent? Or do I want to think about this more holistically on how I can build a fantastic corporate culture that supports the personal professional goals of the sales staff that we're trying to hire?
Absolutely. And I think to that point too, Ken, as we were talking about, is the education for the individuals doing the hiring and doing the coaching and training and development is going to be doubled down from organizations that separate them from good to great. And that's what people want. Candidates come in, and I can't tell you how many times, what does coaching and development look like? Not just for month one, but the tenure of my career, right? It shouldn't stop for them. And so I think oftentimes employers get into like, well, we do great onboarding. Yay, you're right. And so like the organizations that are really investing in leadership, investing in their coaching and development of those managers and upper leadership, those are going to be the companies that people want to stay at, right? Because it's continued development in them, it's continued investment in them. And that in turn makes them more stickier with your company because they're getting what they need.
Yeah, the habit is if you understand anything here, it's the idea that if you stick with doing the same thing the way you've always done it, because that's how you've done it, you will end up being the loser within this essentially talent war. There's no choice but to make changes. And I think that's incumbent upon, when you're talking to HR and anybody else involved in the process, they have to understand, sales already has, a turnover rate that's 3x that of the average other position in your company. And that's 30%. Well, what does that mean? That means every 2.5 years, you essentially turn over your entire sales force. You want to talk about real costs, that's what it is. So I think really, really you have to lean into that. And you have to get the people who are kind of, hey, we like the status quo, to understand there's a significant financial and corporate cultural impact by not making changes.
I think that's a huge point to touch on, right? Is like, how much investment, not only money, but time goes into hiring the right employees, right? So if you're spending that much up front and then you're letting it fall on the wayside on the back end, you are losing so much money and talent, just almost hand over fist. Where if you spend that money to hire, say, an enablement specialist that is going to continue their growth, or a career pathing individual to help them understand what they need to do to be successful, then your money is just continuing to show value over time rather than just losing it and then having to replace somebody right away.
Yeah. Definition of insanity, right? Doing the same things over and over and expecting different results. So, okay. So we've talked about a little bit about maybe what it might look like in the future, but let's give the audience what they need to do differently with their recruiting process.
Then why don't you start?
With the recruiting process, we cannot be going through the same motions that we had before. And essentially what I have experienced in my past is that there are interviews and we tend to go through check boxes, right? And you get a scorecard and it's like, they're confident, they can do this, they can do that. That's not what it's about anymore, right? You have a structured process that you go through, but really the role plays, right? Is this individual able to accept feedback? What is the response once you give them feedback? Are they open to trying to implement that, right? And understanding those underlying skills rather than just checking those boxes that we typically go through.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So in sales, the vast majority of companies that we've come in contact with over the years that I worked with before becoming a consultant, et cetera, we kind of did this thing where we just talked with them. We never put a salesperson in an environment where they had to show us what they would look like in front of a prospect or a customer. So the number one thing you can ask yourself to say, hey, are we doing some of the things right within our recruiting prospect or process is, are you actually making them audition at any point? Right? Are you making them play the role? There's interesting things that you can do throughout. Yes, they take a little bit of edge, but they're the best way to determine whether or not they're going to be a fit and whether they're going to do the necessary things. But, like one of those things is, hey, Liv, I don't know that I'm seeing A+ sales here. And then seeing how Liv responds to it. Because what do you think happens? Objections and the negative feedback and the ability to overcome and handle rejection and ask the tough questions and stay in the moment. Those are such critical skills. When you're testing for, a CFO or an accountant or a software engineer, they have tests that you do. Nobody really created a great, hey, are you going to be a kick butt salesperson based upon this schematic thing? Well, almost nobody, but either way, I think that's just a really critical component. Are you making them audition? Are you putting them under pressure within the sales process?
Yeah. And I think that's really extremely helpful during that process too, because Arthur probably heard me say, but surprises are for birthdays. And I think about the same thing with an interview process and then coming into the role. You should never be shocked about what you're getting into, right? And so being very upfront of, this is a performance-based role. You are choosing a career that is based 100% on your inputs and outputs. Is that okay with you? How does that make you feel? When was the last time you failed at something and what happened? How did you feel? What did you do about it? Those apparent expectations of what they're going to get into and how they feel about that is so important early on in that process.
Yeah, and redefine the role. The truth is, we just talked, things have changed in the last couple of years. The selling environment, the way buyers buy, the fact that we have to be more consultative, that we have to be value driven, that we have to be able to have bigger and better conversations with prospects to get them to do things. If you haven't looked at your job description, your role description, and if you haven't looked at how that's translated into how you write your ad, then you're part of the reason that 76% of candidates say that they were misled with the job description, that they were misled about the role. So from a standpoint of like, what do you got to do different? Let's start with the super basic front end, like get the job description right. That way you can create a wonderful ad. And by the way, create one about the candidate, not about your company. Who are you looking for? What do they look like? What do they feel? What are the experiences they have? So yeah, there's a lot of things we could do. And we could probably talk on this topic for another 38 hours, but I think you really have to lean into the idea that yes, we have to do something different. And I heard an HR professional say, who I respect immensely, about 2 days ago and said, it's so hard to even get people to apply now. I don't want to scare them off. Man, then you're just putting butts in seats, and it may not be the right butt. So I'd be very, very careful with that.
Sometimes
just-
you want to be clear so people aren't making the wrong decision. Again, it's the expectations. But I think too, Ken, this ties really clearly to what we're talking about, like the expectations from an employee now is spending time to talk about not only what it looks like to be in this performance-based role, but what does it look like for career coaching and pathing from the organization? What is the support you will continue to get, and bringing that up proactively within conversations? Because let's be real too, when you've got a great candidate on the phone, you instantly as an interviewer go, they're probably interviewing at 10 other places. So how can I be different about this organization where I am coming from so that they know what they're going to get when they're making those decisions?
And speaking from like a rep's perspective, I actually see this as a huge benefit because you do get to see what does that coaching look like live, right? I want to see the feedback that they're giving me, and am I agreeing with it? Am I saying, wow, I didn't think of it differently, and you called out some of my blind spots? So speaking from Chili Piper's interview process, when I came in as an AE, I loved it. I thought it was very experiential, not behavioral. Hey, tell me about things you did in the past, because hopefully as a sales rep, you can sell yourself. But I think in those role plays, those assessments, there's no hiding. It's you and the interviewer. So I actually liked it from a hint of, oh, this is what I can kind of expect in the role in terms of the coaching they offer me.
Yeah, write this down if you're listening to this right now. Here's what Arthur said, and they said in a sentence that I use when I've interviewed people, historically, and that is, I'm looking for somebody who can be a student and an instructor in the same conversation. Mm-hmm. You're curious and you want to know the things about the things you don't know the things about, and you're humble enough to understand it. But when we hit a topic that matters to you, you know how to make me see the value in your expertise.
Yeah. No, that's a great segue, Ken, into our next topic here is like, what do we want to look for in a candidate aside from maybe that student and instructor? What are some other things that the audience can start to pinpoint and say, hey, this is going to be a top performer?
Yeah, I think ultimately you've got to look for things you're not looking for, because the biggest mistake that companies are making right now is they're selling the company in the interviews instead of having the candidates sell themselves. And so, there's two massive things that we look for when we go through and teach companies how to do our sales training and acquisition routine. And that is, we're looking for, hey, their commitment or their will to sell. Like, are they committed to do whatever it takes to be successful? Right. And so you really got to dig into, what does that commitment level look like? Is sales just a job? For me, I was a poli-sci major who then stumbled into a sales job. Well, I was committed to being successful, but what do you do when you're in social sciences and you realize there's no money to be made? Well, you go into sales. So I went into sales. But luckily for me, I was immensely coachable. Right. And I think you've got to look at, hey, how committed are they to the role? Can they take coaching, which I know, and I've seen examples how Liv does a fantastic job of that in the interviews. And then what are your sales competencies, and how do you actually figure out, can they be a consultative seller? Can they be a value seller? Will they have the fortitude to go hunt? But we kind of skip those things and try to hire people who look and feel and sound like us.
I think it's a big no. The look, the feel, and the sound like us type of a comment too, right? Is like thinking outside of what that could be. Because with this new employment market, as well as people coming from all over with different industries that have applicable skill sets, but you're not going to think about asking that person those same questions in every single interview. So when I think about that too, and I mean, mistakes that we've all made, right? Is not constantly looking at what we're looking for and evaluating the people and the basic skill sets that we need, like coaching. So I would also say, if you're on this call too, you should actively be going back and looking at your process. And like Ken said, with your job descriptions, who you're actually looking for, because that's going to translate into how you interview and how your managers interview. So then you're all aligned. I think the will, like you're talking about, is a huge piece of it. One of my favorite questions to ask in interviews is, what do I need to know about you? We have a finite amount of time to get to know each other, and that will open up a wealth of information that'll help you dig into it further. But just asking those really simple questions and just leaving it there will help you figure out, where is this person's mindset? What do they really care about? If it's, what do I need to know about you? And somebody says, actually play the piccolo. That's great. I love that you have a musical instrument, but there's also individuals that are, I came from a really rough life in my background, or these things happened and I am now more driven to succeed than ever because I don't want to be in that situation again. Coming to answers like that tells me why this individual is going to be really hardworking here versus somebody that says, I'm a really hard worker. That doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, I think being humble is something that's so hard, right? In the day of social media, like if you looked at everybody's LinkedIn profiles, including mine, okay, look at everybody's LinkedIn profiles, nobody's failed. There's not a single failure in the world, not a single one of the billion people that are on LinkedIn. But the truth is your origin story really goes to that commitment, because if you dig deeper on me as an example, you'll see that I've talked openly about a bankruptcy 10 years ago. Because those are the things that actually have built the character that have allowed me to succeed. So those are things that you can also look for. Are they going to be coachable? Do they have the will, the commitment? Because it shows you what's behind the motivation. And it's just so critical.
It is. That's what I love. We've gotten so far away from, what motivates you? What keeps you motivated?
Yeah.
You can get such scripted answers from that tell you nothing, and you've just wasted 3 minutes of an interview that's only 45 minutes. So I think it's another piece here is when you're looking at what those questions are that you really want to answer, make sure you and your team and your manager, whoever in your revu is going to be doing those interviews, that those questions are researched, right? And they're finite and they're giving you exactly what you want, because the last thing you want to do is come out of that 30-45 minute interview and not have a decision on your candidate, right? That should also lead you to go back and say, I'm not asking the right questions, or I'm not asking it in a way to get the information that I need to have a confident answer at the end of this interview about this candidate.
I'd love to go down that path. I know it's off the beaten path right now, but can we share with the audience maybe some of your favorite questions to ask candidates in the interview to identify these competencies or these virtues that we know often isn't a top performer? What are some of the top questions you like to ask, Ken, in an interview?
So here's the deal. I know that Liv is a really awesome interviewer. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw it to her, because then I'll take notes on her great questions.
Love it.
Fantastic. I like to know interesting stories about them. So when I first come into my interview, right, I have my upfront contract, because again, surprises are for birthdays, should know exactly what's going to happen during this interview process, is help me understand your professional journey and what led to us having a conversation today. Again, that opens up the floor for them. And what you'll see from different candidates is some people will give you everything under the sun, right? Or they'll jump around. Well, that me internally, I'm questioning now their organization, right? They're going to be, I'm hyper organized. You couldn't even structure your story and your journey of your professional career in an organized way, right? Like,
yeah,
noted kind of a deal. And then other individuals, which I really lean into, is when they tie, even if they're coming from education, they tie their journey and the skill set back to sales, right? I want to know you want to be in sales. So if you're an educator, right? And I'm like, talk to me about how these relate, and you can tie that back to sales, like, absolutely great. Again, the what do I need to know about you question, because we only have a finite amount of time to get to know each other, is one of my favorite. And I'll leave time after that questions, because naturally I'm going to want to know a little bit more about that, because it's not just understanding why you're here, but in addition to that, what does it look like to support you within that, knowing that? How do we keep that drive going? Not a constant reminder of it, but if you're having a rough time, what do I want to say to you, or what do you need to hear to pull us back on track? I really like those types of questions.
Awesome. Yeah. When I'm looking for like the will to sell, when I'm looking for, are they coachable? What are their sales competencies? One of the things that I will do is probably the biggest thing I'll do is I will lean into the resume and start looking for the gaps. So I really want to pull out the gaps and start to understand why they're there. So if they say I did this, but they don't have a number by it, well, tell me how you measured you were successful. Mm-hmm. What leads you to believe that was the case, right? What did you do to do that? I'm looking oftentimes for somebody who can tell me, hey, I have a process that I follow, because this process means that I can repeat my success. I know of sales reps, sales managers, and leaders who've been one-hit wonders and just single threaded at one company. And so you can say, oh, I saw you sold 22 million. Awesome. Tell me how.
Tell me how.
And then when they can't, then you're going to start asking questions. Well, how many of your own leads did you source? How much of it was inbound? What was your closing rate? If you had to rebuild your business today, how would you go about doing that? How long would it take? And so really what I'm looking for when I start talking about sales reps, or even when I talk about sales management and leaderships, I'm saying, okay, what are the things you're not saying on your resume? Because those are the things that I've got to dig into to truly understand you. Because let's be honest, a resume is a marketing tool, right? And what I want to get is to the real human behind the marketing tool.
I love asking after that too is, this is a change for you because every job is a change, regardless if you're coming within sales or within out, is what's one thing that you're really excited about? And what's one thing that makes you nervous?
Yeah.
And that nervous question, right, is people will be very vulnerable for you. And that's what I want. I want you to be honest with me about what you're nervous about, because I want to know that going into it. And whatever that nerve is okay. That's okay. I just want you to be open and honest with me. And then we can help with resources, support. We can answer any other types of questions, ease any types of concerns. But I really like the excited and nervous question.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I love that one too, Liv. I'm glad you mentioned it because I actually heard Alina, our CEO, mention often when we do work that we don't like, we tend to call that stress. But when we do work that we do like, we tend to call that passion. And I've actually been incorporating that in her interview and saying, what's one thing that stresses you out about this role? And what's one thing you're passionate about? So very similar questions, but you get to hear kind of in the minds of the candidate, hey, and if they're being vulnerable, right? Or if they're going to give you that fluff answer of like, oh, sometimes I think I put too much time into my work. Okay, that doesn't stress you out that much.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Any other questions that we'd want to share with the audience before we go on to motivation?
I think the biggest thing is going back and looking at your process too, and what are you trying to understand? And then formulating those, not just surface level Google questions, but with your team, how can you ask that in a way that's going to get you what you want rather than those just basic questions?
Yeah, and that comes back to using a scorecard, right? So you can have consistency of questions. Too often where you play the interviewer role and you're doing it by yourself and you're doing it off the cuff, and you came off a Zoom meeting, much like many of the participants did today. They jumped on this 37 seconds after they were in something else. And I think when you start to talk about that preparation component of having a scorecard, which I do on every single interview. And then generally, if you're in a good decent sized company, you probably want a second pair of eyes just to kind of tell you if you're seeing the same stuff. I think from a tactical perspective is a pretty successful way to do it.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so now the topic of motivating your sales team. I know we're talking about recruiting, and that's very important, but I think companies often do a very poor job of retaining their top talent and understanding what does motivate them and how do we keep them here. So Olivia, I've heard your reps talk about you in such high regard. I think you're a master at this. Would love to hear your thoughts on how you motivate your sales team.
Letting the sirens go by to hopefully not pierce everyone's ears like it's piercing mine. Well, this first one, right? Who needs motivation? Everybody needs motivation. And I think even from my perspective in my level, something I've learned in the past is that we oftentimes will focus on our ICs and what really gets them going. But then what happens is we lack in our management support, right? We lack in what motivates them. So really trying to focus on having your managers feel really supported and motivated so that trickles down to their ICs. And a lot of that, what it comes down to is just understanding what they want, right? Understanding what they need. And every person is individual. So you can't have like a sweeping motivation, right? And I think when I was in sales, we were doing monster blitzes and literally calling off of printed pieces of paper. And everybody assumed like everybody's motivation was that money. And like, yes, we're all in sales, so that's why we want it. But for me individually, it was like, I'm a kick-ass sales human. I want to work on my professional development here, but nobody's really talking to me about that or about what I want to keep me motivated in the way I want to be motivated. And so I think this culture, kind of going back to not only what the company can do for me, but what I can do for the company, what I want, is a really good finite way to figure out how everybody's bespoke motivation plays into what you actually are doing to help motivate them. And I think a lot of that too is that honesty piece of it, right? And it doesn't seem, or it might seem counterintuitive to be very honest with people and going along with motivation, is that understanding where you're at, right? And being very transparent, because that's that trust and that build that happens during that relationship. So that allows people to talk more about what they're actually feeling. What does motivate me? What does keep me going at the end of the day? And how do you as a manager and you as a leader play a part within that?
Awesome. So let's clear some space here. I want to step up on my soapbox for a second.
Please do.
So, holy cow, come on now. Seriously, here's the thing that's happening. You've most of the time we've actually promoted managers who are decent individual contributors, who are solid individual contributors to high performers who didn't have good management, who did not actually take motivation from somebody else, and they had no role model to show it. And you wonder why most of your sales force isn't motivated, because your manager's belief system doesn't support coaching or motivating, because they don't know how important it is for the vast majority of individuals on your team. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, Liv, you said it perfectly. There's intrinsic, extrinsic, and altruistic motivation. And the extrinsic motivation that we used to associate with sales reps was money, 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 right? Those Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross. It's like, hey, first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado, second prize is steak knives, and third prize is you're fired, right? That extrinsic motivation used to be the thing. But we've seen a whole new set of sales reps come up that are motivated by altruistic things. And if you run a competition, say that you want people to do something, and you're going to pay them an extra $6, and you're wondering why nobody's leaning in or looks happy about it, it's because you'd be better off if you told them you'd give them a day off. You'd be better off if you said, we'll contribute $1,000 to your local charity that you're passionate about. But it really comes down to this. It's a belly to belly deal. Right? Motivating, coaching, leading is a human to human endeavor. And so we have to make sure that our managers understand how important it is, because there are essentially two goals for management and leadership, and that's it. Right? So one of them is, I need to help the people on my team become better critical thinkers so that they can self-sustain their own success. The second thing, though, I need them to believe that they're capable of this much more than they ever thought they were. And so as a manager or a leader, that's what you've got to lean into. And the only way you can do that is by following, coaching, motivating, and holding teams accountable. If you're not good at those three things, your team will suffer.
Absolutely. And I think it's, to your point too, Ken, is from a cultural perspective, right? If you think about, I think about like our large 40 SDR org, is that I want these people to be a part of this organization. And so many of them want to go into leadership, that if we can properly model that now, and those individuals are going to grow within our organization, that's exponentially just going to scale along with them. So if you start creating that culture, it's only going to continue to build. I think one thing that does happen often is when you start to scale, the first thing that goes, because you get so focused on those numbers and that performance, is that individual motivation, when it should be the other way around. If you're properly motivating your people because you've hired correctly and you're investing in them continuously, they're just going to continue to stay and be happy and healthy. But you have to keep that focus and intentionally keep it top of mind.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting that you mentioned that, Liv, because I know, to Ken's point earlier, you're basically turning over your sales team every 2.5 years. And I believe it was Mark Roberge where he at HubSpot created 2 different paths. Not everybody wants to be a manager, but if they feel like that's their only next step up, maybe that's when they start looking elsewhere. So he actually created an individual contributor kind of promotional path that you can keep getting up and keep getting raises. Would love to hear both your thoughts on that, because I feel like oftentimes we're only shown that one promotional path of, hey, if you do a good enough job as an individual contributor, guess what? You get to manage a bunch of people, which might not be your skill set.
It's so bad. Like there's two things in sales that I hate about career pathing. One is that you need to move from being an SDR to an AE or a BD or a BDM as fast as possible. Because I literally think that if you'll sit in the SDR role for a couple of years, learn how to do it, it's worth $1 million over the course of your career, because you'll have a skill set nobody else will. So that's like kind of the first thing. And then I think ultimately the second thing that we do is that's just the presupposed thing. Hey, the next step for any kind of success beyond that is that you manage. Well, the truth is that's a whole nother thing. Do you like actually getting things done through others? Or would you rather just go kick butt yourself? And so I love the idea of creating separate paths, because you get yourself in such a thing where the Peter principle starts to apply. You end up promoting people to their level of incompetence, and then they're stink at the job. They're unhappy. They turn over, and there's no role for them to go back to because you've backfilled behind them.
Absolutely. And I think especially within rev orgs, and I'll speak, specifically about the SDR motion and about the SDR org, is that oftentimes people find, actually, I like to sell, or I think I want to sell into the current client base, or I think my skill set that I'm developing here is going to be more beneficial for the company in a CS role or whatever it might be. So one thing I think is really valuable and something that our teams work really hard at Chili Piper is exposing them to every path that they could take, whether it's engineering. What does it take to be an engineer? What do I need to do to start to do that? And then what does it look like for my promotion there? So we're really big on, yeah, I want you to be successful in sales. I'd love for you to be an account executive and go kick ass over there. But if we've identified that that's not necessarily the path that's going to fill your bucket long term, let's talk and let's look at where else your skill set might be best suited. And on the other side, what's going to fill your bucket, right? Because we talk about that cultural piece of it. It's not just your skills, but what is going to make you ultimately happy? Because if you're happy, you're more likely to stay here. You're more likely to tell other people to stay here, and you feel supported in your continued growth.
And you'll be a higher performer if you're happy in general.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a key part that I don't think a lot of people talk about, but that's how he was able to, now I'm talking about Mark Roberge at HubSpot, keep sales reps for like 8 years, which is unheard of in today's day and age, because they knew that they could continue to progress in the company without having to take that management role. Yeah. All right. I know we're getting to the end of this, so I do have maybe a couple questions myself, but let's bring it back to the audience. After hearing these two speak, anything that's top of mind, or does somebody want to come off mute and kind of talk through, whether it's from a managerial perspective, maybe you're unfortunately went through some layoffs and you're looking for some tips on how to really attract that next company? We're all ears here.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, I mean, I think let's just kind of lean back on a couple things, right? You have to do a process. You have to have a process, and that process must be different than you have for the rest of the hiring roles. You have to put something that's repeatable. You have to take the ability to test people to get them to audition when it comes down to what they're doing for the sales role. You cannot be afraid, which I think is what I've seen a lot of companies lately run into, which you can tell by Liv's questions is the exact opposite of how she approaches it and why she's so successful recruiting. But you can't be afraid to challenge people, have questions, to put things that make somebody feel uncomfortable. Because in case you haven't noticed, sales is about being comfortable, being uncomfortable. So you absolutely have to be able to stand in and kind of make sure that your process is dialed in and that you're doing things differently. If you're not doing that, and if HR is running the exact same play that they're running for your engineers, your admin, your accounting department, that might be part of the reason why you're not having the success attracting or retaining the talent that you're looking for.
I love that, Ken. That's such a big point too, is, we have like several things that are our responsibility. The number one is to recruit and retain. So if your recruiters, if you're not hip to hip with them and not talking to them about every candidate, what went well, what are we looking for? If they don't have that same type of alignment, not only is that a waste of time for your organization, but the time it gets to you, it's not going to be what you want. And to your point, Ken, it is much different than any other type of recruiting role. So if you can get their heads wrapped around that too, and you are locked at the hip with them, they're going to be assessing in the same way, which then just gives so much more continuity between your process.
Yeah, awesome. So we do have thanks, David. We do have one question here that came in. So let me see if you guys can see that. How could we better communicate sales strategy and sales process to sales reps in the hiring moment, or even the latter after they're hired?
Say that one more time.
So I think the question is, how can we better communicate either like the sales methodology or the sales strategy we use to the sales rep throughout the process? I'm wondering if it's maybe that's not talked about, and then they get hired after and they're like, oh, I didn't really know this was the sales process. So I guess sounds like it's coming from an interviewer saying, how do I communicate this better to reps throughout the hiring process?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. So I'd reframe it, because I don't think you should be communicating it as much as you should be looking for what their sales methodologies and processes are that they've followed, to see whether or not those things can translate into the type of methodology or process you use. That's first. I would reframe it. It's sort of that thing we said, we got to be looking at not necessarily communicating them how we do it, but figuring out how they've done it. So I think that's the first piece of the puzzle, is to actually ask those types of questions. I think the other side of when you're talking about the methodology and the process is Ken just had a brain fart. So I don't even remember what the second point was. So Liv, maybe you've got something more intelligent than that last thing I said.
No, I think it's important too, is when you're talking to these candidates, right, whether it's an AE, SDR, AM role, is helping them understand what their responsibility is within that sales process and what happens next, right? So we talk about expectations. We talk about what the process looks like, but not only through those initial steps, but through the entire cycle, right? Because again, surprises are for birthdays. Nobody should be showing up of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing here. But if you're giving them that knowledge throughout the process in those different ways, they're naturally going to see that.
And maybe the second thing that I was going to say is this: what I look for is people who are used to a specific run rate. Like if you just want to say, hey, how do I know that they'll fit? And if they come in, is it a surprise? Well, if they're used to, say, having to run 12 deals a quarter, and then you're moving them into an enterprise role that closes 4 deals a year, and they're used to doing 12 deals a quarter where they hand it off and have no ongoing relationship. And now you're trying to get them to have relationships and do 4 deals a year. Those are the types of things like that I would look for. It says, hey, are they going to actually be happy in this role? And what shows they can? Because historically we found there are some people who can go from a highly transactional to a much higher value sale. But those are some of the indicators I would use to understand, do they fit with our sales process and our strategy?
I love that.
Awesome. No, thank you for the question. Great question. I do like your reframe, Ken, of rather than trying to communicate to them, know what you're looking for and how do we ask questions to dig in deeper of like, hey, I see on your resume, you kind of, it seems like a little bit of a transactional sale. Talk to me about your process, or how many ops you're closing a month, and start to really understand, hey, is this person going to fit in? And to your point earlier, if you're not hearing that, maybe call them out on that, make them a little uncomfortable and saying, hey, that's great. I'm hearing a lot of maybe not an A+ sales rep, to really get their objection handling going and seeing how does this match up to my sales process. So
yeah,
thank you for that question.
Arthur, real quick. And the thing, understand this, when you start testing candidates, they're not going to be used to it. And some of them are going to complain that your process is hard. Then you're doing it right.
Yes.
Okay. We were interviewing VPs of sales for a client of ours, and we literally went through 5 of them who had, 3 numbers on their resumes. They couldn't quantify their success. And then when we asked them to quantify their success, they couldn't quantify their success, couldn't tell us the reproducible process of building a sales system and a process for a company. And then they were upset that we had asked the questions. Well, guess what? We saved our client the problem of hiring somebody who couldn't do the job. Yeah. So right butt, right seat, instead of just a butt in a seat.
No butts in seats. Right.
Look at that, impeccable timing right there on the 45 minutes. If you all like this is an opportunity to really dig deep in with Ken and his team. They're doing a bunch of fantastic things. They're scaling at a hyper rate because they're delivering results for their clients. So apparently 98% of us sleep right beside our smartphones. I'm guessing it's right there. Please go ahead and scan this. Take advantage of that opportunity to meet with Ken and his team. I know you won't be disappointed. Ooh, I don't know if we can have one more question here that came in from Joe. Let's do it. Okay. What types of questions do you look for from a candidate? Okay. So maybe this is at the end when they're saying, hey, now I'm going to pass the mic off to you. What questions do you have for me? What are some questions that you like to hear from candidates?
I like to hear genuine questions. And then I like to ask why when somebody, when somebody's talking about, well, what is the success rate of SDRs? What is the promotion rate? That's a really great question. Tell me what you were looking for. Tell me what your expectation is. Why is that important to you? And that's where you really get in. Did you just Google these questions and you're asking me, or do you genuinely care about the success rate, right? Because those are what I want to know. It's also individuals that ask You know, the culture is great. I love our culture. I could tell you up and down why I love our culture and why it is so amazing. But what are you looking for? What are the needs that you need in a company to be able to see that? And then to just genuine curiosity. You know, I have the same upfront contract for every interview that I do. And I specifically say during this portion, it's going to naturally have some questions that arise on your end. Do ask those so that we can keep it conversational. The individuals at that point, at the very beginning, who are asking me questions, when I say keep it conversational, I'm sensing there's genuine curiosity there versus waiting to the very end. I'm like, well, we talked about that. I said we could be conversational and you didn't ask me about it. Like that tells me something.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is it may not be the type of questions, but as much as how you engage in the conversation. So think about it this way: if you're prospecting or you're working with new customers, whatever that looks like, you want to be able to not let them take control of the conversation, even though they're going to try and wrestle it away from you. So even it's hard in an interview, but man, the best candidates do this really well. And that is, hey, you know, this is going to be an interview and it's going to sound a little bit like I'm a reporter and just hammering you with questions. I'll give you some time at the end to ask questions. Well, what I look for is somebody who doesn't wait till the end, because there's naturally things that I'm going to ask throughout the course of that interview that are going to create a question that could create a part of a conversation, because that's about engaging me. And that's something that we need sales professionals to be able to do. And so it's really, and, you know, we always say, you know, start curious, stay curious. It's that ability to do that and have real conversations with people, because if you're going to take somebody from why things are the way they are today to things the way they need to be in the future, you're going to have to be able to engage them throughout that entire conversation, not just when they hand you the mic.
Yeah. I like, just to add into that, Joe, I love when I hear candidates say, well, when I was doing my research, this was pretty interesting to me. I just want to see, I think the interview process is a reflection of the sales skill set and how you should be acting with your prospects. So if they're not doing any research or saying stuff like, hey, you've answered all my questions, good luck. That's like the death kiss of any interview. So I love when candidates come in and have some, hey, while I was doing research, this really spoke out to me. What, can I hear your thoughts a little bit on that? Oh, I'm like, yes, thank you. You're doing your research. This is great.
100%.
All right, Joe, thank you so much for your question. I know it came in the last minute, but I'm glad we can handle it. Again, please take advantage of Ken and his team over at RevHeat. They are fantastic. And keep an eye out for our next session. Would love to keep this going. Thank you all so much. And we'll catch you on the next one.
All right.
See ya.
Take care, everyone.